Today's session is called Getting University Market Insight Right, looking at the structures, the data, and enhancing the overall offer. And I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Andy Youell here, who is a higher education data expert. Andy, you've been working in HE data and systems for over 30 years, is that right?
That's right, yes. And I slightly hesitate at the use of the word expert because they say that an X is a has-been and a spurt is a drip under pressure.
Okay, well, I consider you as highly respected in higher education. So, yeah, I can't wait to hear your insight into today's topic. And I'm Penny Eccles, CEO and founder of Marketing Partnership. We've been around for almost 5 years now, and we typically help institutions to grow their student numbers or to get more of the right students for them. Um, so why are we running this session? Well, to achieve growth, to achieve that student recruitment growth, you must understand the data and you must have real market insight to enhance the overall offer. But we found in working with our clients, there are very different approaches to how they receive data and how they get that valuable insight. Sometimes the team forms part of the External Relations Directorate, and sometimes it's part of a separate planning and data function. What's the right answer, and how indeed do we use data and insight to answer those really challenging problems in higher education? But Andy, so first to you, I'd be really intrigued to hear, what is it like to be in a planning function right now in higher education? What are those pressing concerns?
So I think the evolution of the planning concept, the planning community in higher education over recent years has been really interesting. I mean, yes, I've been in this sector a long time. When I started in HE in the early 90s, it was often the case that a university would have a planning officer,
Mm-hmm.
and that person would be doing mostly stuff like student number planning. They would probably be reporting into a finance director, and it was all very contained, and it kind of reflected where we were with data back then, 30 years ago, and what our expectations of data were 30 years ago. We are now living in a very different world. And obviously, we have a huge amount of expectation about the value that we can derive from data. And the fact that we're having this conversation today, the fact that we've got so many brilliant people on the call, there's all of this expectation, all this desire around data. And the planning departments, although the language, the terminology varies across institution to institution, as everything does in HE, the planning departments largely have become the focal point for data and driving value out of data. And I think there, broadly speaking, there are two ways in which they face. Planning departments obviously look to their internal stakeholders to help universities and HE providers understand themselves better, management statistics, performance indicators, whatever language we use around that. And the other thing is the external view. The planning departments will often play a significant role in making the data returns and then engaging with this rapacious beast of data collection and increasingly funding and now regulation through the medium of data. So they're looking in both directions.
Mm.
And I think one of the biggest challenges for the planning area, the data area in institutions now, is to sort of understand and reconcile those different views of the reality that happens within an institution. There's very much the internal view, and then there's how the outside world sees us.
Yeah, I know certainly from my own experience when I had a small market insight team in one of the universities I worked with, and somebody thought, no, it needs to be part of the overarching planning team, and I was kind of sold on the idea, and then I realized that this team, I'd almost lost them because they just got just totally subsumed by that beast, the HESA thing and data returns and yeah, it's a massive pressure, isn't it, for those people?
It's a huge pressure, and obviously, the last 12, 18 months, there's been particular pressures around the changes to the HESA return, and that's probably for discussion on another day. But more generally, there's this huge expectation about the value that we can drive from data, and I think the planning teams, they're very much at the heart of that. And I think there's something really interesting that's gone on around our expectations of data. And I sort of think back to when I was a lad, when I started work in 1987 for Rolls-Royce in Bristol, making jet engines.
Hmm.
And my first job there, and I was doing business statistics. And I'd run a job against our mainframe computer, and I'd get loads of this sort of fanfold paper out, and then we produced graphics on the dot matrix printers, and that was all how it was in the 1980s. And it was business statistics, and that's kind of where we were. A little aside, when HESA was set up in 1992, it was originally going to be called the Higher Education Data Agency. And just before it was formed, the founding chief executive, Brian Ramsden, said, I wanted to be the Higher Education Statistics Agency because statistics are more valuable than data.
Ah,
And so there's something about the aspiration there. Since then, we've lived through the 1990s, which was the era of management information, because information is better than statistics. In the 2000s, we went through the era of business intelligence, because intelligence is better than information. And nowadays, if you look around and look on the job market, people don't talk about business intelligence anymore. They talk about insight. And indeed, the title of the session that you've chosen, Penny,
yeah,
it's about insight, and it speaks to a higher level of aspiration about the value that we can drive for data. There is one organisation in the AG sector that's kind of turned it up another notch. It's like the amps that go to number 11. The Office for Students talk about foresight, and so this is even beyond insight. This is about, give us your return and we will predict your future. It speaks to this incredibly high level of aspiration and expectation about the value that we can derive from data. And I think we're using the same tools that by and large that we've always had. We're using the same data sets we've always had, but there is now so much expectation about what we can do with data.
yeah, massive. I'm really mindful. So one of the sessions we run, if anyone's interested, is we go to universities and we work with their marketing teams on the 6 killer stats that they really need to know about each of their subject areas. And I was running this session with marketing teams to help them to build subject specific marketing plans. And they got a little upset because they felt, why are we not getting this stuff from our planning team? Why, this is valuable data. We need this to inform our products. We need to inform what our competitors are doing. We need to inform our market share. So, how could marketing and student recruitment colleagues work better with their planning teams to get that timely insight?
Okay, I'm a bit of a pedant about language here, and I'm going to pick up on some of the words that you use, because I think this is really important. You talked about access to data,
Yeah,
and in this sort of hierarchy of value, data is the foundational piece. And then you said, how do we get access to insight? And for me, insight is the very top level. It's that higher value stuff. So
yeah,
actually, the question I think that we need to unpick here is how do we take that journey from data to insight? How do we go from data, statistics, information, intelligence, insight? How do we get to that very top level? And I think that's where the magic lies. That's what everyone wants, apart
yeah,
from the OFS, who want to go to foresight, that's fine. But I mean, that's the magic we all want, is we want insight. We want that very top layer of magic. And I think, however you are structured, and whatever the roles and structures look like within each institution, it has to be a highly collaborative piece. Okay.
mm, mm.
You think if you think of data and statistics, so we can go to a system, we can extract some data, we can turn it into statistics. We then need to travel from information intelligence insight, and to take that journey, it is about wrapping some meaning, wrapping some context
Yeah.
around the data. Some people refer to this as warm data. It's the contextual wrapper. It's giving it meaning. And for that stuff to get to that higher level, you really need to have a fairly rich understanding of the real world that the data purports to represent. The thing about data is that it has a habit of simplifying everything, because data structures like to fit the world into nice, neat little boxes and nice, neat
Mhm.
little categories.
Mm.
And sometimes the world isn't like that. Sometimes the world is a bit more complex. It is a bit more fluid and dynamic. So there are real restrictions about actually how much you can do with just data. So to get to that insight piece, you need to be able to look to the data. You then need to be able to look out to the real world and say, actually, what meaning, what value, what insight does this data give me about the real world? And for that, I think the key thing is about subject matter expertise. And so it is the coming together of the people who do the data and statistics and the subject matter experts to try and layer on the meaning and the value for that.
So I guess in that instance, the only people who know that UCAS journey, that student recruitment journey, and all of the things that are important to university choice actually are the marketers. So they're the ones who provide the context, and hopefully, using your terminology, the data can absolutely come from the planners, but together they provide the insight. Is that right?
I, 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 I think that's right, and we could unpick that even further and think about the data. And you're absolutely right. There's the context around, in this example, but the UCAS statistic. There's the context around that. You also need to have some understanding of how those business processes manifest themselves in the data. So therefore, what actually does the data represent? How do the
Mm.
business processes become data? You need to have some understanding of that, because sometimes, as you know, on that journey from the real world to a data set, sometimes there are things that happen in business processes that you might not expect, or might sort of warp the data in some way that you don't expect. So I think it's really important. You need to have that understanding of the real world. You also then need to have the understanding of how the real world becomes data. So in this example, I would suggest, when looking at the statistics that come out of UCAS, I would suggest absolutely you need the marketing people, because the market is about that interface between supply and demand. So there's that context. I would suggest you also need the admissions people, because they understand the process, and
Totally.
therefore how the process becomes data. And by
Yeah.
actually getting those people together around the table, you can then look at the statistics and you can climb the ladder up to insight.
So for the marketers and those involved in student recruitment, can you give any tips for them to how to look for those trends and in the wider sector? Where would you start looking?
Where would I start looking? Well, look, I mean, the data and the published data is always, kind of the obvious place to start. I'm going to pick up on another word you've said there, because you've said another really important word there, which is trends.
Okay.
Um, and I mean, everyone wants the trends. You don't want a moment in time. You want the trends, and it's actually by looking at the trends that we can maybe start to extrapolate and think about where the future is going to go. So the trends are really important. So the published data is really valuable in this case, because one of the things that the data publishing organizations do, because they are professionals, HESA, UCAS, Student Loans Company, whoever it is, they will be working to professional statistician standards, and they will ensure that that if they are publishing data over multiple years, it is comparable. And
Yeah.
if it is not comparable, they will include in the notes and definitions, which I'm afraid you do have to read. They're a bit boring and dense at times, but you do have to read them. They will include in the notes and definitions reasons why the data has changed year on year. So actually, to get to that trend piece, I would always start with the published statistics, because that provides the foundation layer. You then kind of want to go back out into that warm data world, that area of context, that area of softer stuff. So look, in the marketing area, I would be looking for things like, for example, demographic data. And obviously, there's huge things happening with the demographics in the UK at the moment. So you look at that as well, and the projections of the number of 18-year-olds coming into the system. You would then look at things like, for example, industry data. If you're operating in particular subjects, you would
Mhm.
look at industry data, you would look at government policy. So, we have a new government now. Already they are saying very different things about the value of arts and humanities
Yeah.
to the sort of language that we had with the previous government, which was absolutely focused on STEM and employability. And so you could sort of, there's probably an emerging theme in there. You would obviously look at what your competitors are doing, and you would obviously look at what your competitors are publishing on their websites. You will also, and I'm sure this community, I'm sure this community networks furiously, and you will be keeping your ear to the ground. And the journey to insight is about bringing all of these things together, I think, and it no longer becomes a conversation about just data or just analyzing data. It becomes bringing all of this stuff together.
Okay, so have you seen this work really well, this relationship between the planners and the insight function and the marketing student recruitment functions?
I look that the higher education sector is gloriously diverse, and institutions, some institutions work well in some areas, some work well in other ways. I have certainly seen institutions do really good stuff with data, and drive up that whole conversation around data. Maybe one example I will mention. A few years ago, there was a guy at the University of Cardiff, a guy called John Britton, who won an award actually for creating a data community within the university. He won a HESPA award for that. And what that did was it actually brought together data professionals from right across the business. So there were registry, planning, HR, finance, and people from academic departments, and they all came together on a reasonably regular basis. I think it was about once a month, and they
Mm.
came together and they shared experience, they shared knowledge, they shared data, obviously, because if you get data people together, you kind of have to share the data. But there was something about creating that culture and environment of people coming together to actually just talk about data and talk about what the data was telling us. And that might sound a bit geeky, and maybe it is, but there is something about, you just have to get people in a room and you have to start those conversations and create an environment in which those conversations can thrive. And then actually people in different parts of the business, they will go off and they say, I will talk to you about that outside the room, and I will follow up with you about that. And it's actually about bringing these things together, because you don't get to insight without that sort of thing happen. You're probably struggling around in information somewhere. You want to get to insight, you have to get those conversations going.
I think I've two examples of where I've seen it work really well. So one institution, I did make a concerted effort to make friends with the director of planning, and we got to this place where we had this wonderful glimpse as to what real insight could look like and how it could drive the strategy of the institution. I remember one time we did a I thought it was amazing. This clearing paper where we wrote about three different scenarios. You know, if we took this amount of students, this would be the effect on our achieved tariff, and therefore our ultimate effect on league tables going forward. And then if we went for scenario B, this is how it would look like. And it just felt like we were doing things deliberately as an institution rather than things happening to us. And then another time, a bit like your example, at another institution, student number planning had always been people sitting in their own offices doing their own calculations. Um, you know, many of them were based on just the money they needed rather than what was actually happening out there. And we just decided to just have a whole day, the planners, the marketers, and the academics in a room, and we just had a conversation. You know, if you're going to get that extra 20 people on that course, do the market forces suggest that's going to happen? And if not, what are we going to do over and above to achieve that target? And you know, these are rare, you know, examples, just fleeting moments in my career, which were actual highlights for me because they felt more intelligent, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that absolutely makes sense. So I think there's a really interesting thing, isn't there, about data and how data is perceived, and I think a lot of people, and I've seen this a lot in my career in HEs, especially actually with senior level, with vice chancellors and pro vice chancellors, that I often get this thing of I don't do data. There's almost a fear of the data. I don't want to engage with the data. They do data over there, and that sense
Mm.
of really of really pushing it away. But I think what you're talking about, the examples you're talking about there, Penny, I think is absolutely right, because fundamentally it's about the people. Yeah, it's not about the data and the structures and the technology and all the sums and maths and all that complicated stuff. It's about people getting around a table and saying, what is this telling us? What
Mm.
does this mean to us? So you know, if you're doing data in a university, actually you're in the people business. To be successful, you have to think of yourself as being in the people business, because it's only by unlocking those conversations that really happens, and that has to be given time. I love the idea you talk about having a day where you just lock yourselves away for a day and just have a conversation, and you kind of have to be prepared to commit to make that investment, because sometimes these conversations won't go anywhere,
Yeah.
and other times they will. You know, sometimes the magic will happen, and I think there's something about facilitating those conversations, and then obviously following up on the points that come with them. But that's where the magic happens. I mean, we
Yeah.
must stop thinking about this whole thing as being a technical thing.
Yeah.
It's
Do you
not.
know,
It's all about people.
Andy, as I get older and hopefully a bit wiser, and you know, as I've had greater exposure to more institutions and how they do things, I can't help but think that so many things could be solved purely by stronger trust and better relationships.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So the killer, maybe controversial question for you, which I think everybody's waiting for the answer on, is so where exactly should market insight and planning sit? And if they're outside of the marketing function, how do you really make it work?
Um, okay, so you know, one of the really interesting things about higher education is that we often use the same job titles to mean slightly different things, and we'll you know have different structures, different organograms, and that's fine. So I'm going to attempt to swerve giving a clear answer to that question. But actually, no, I think this is quite important, because I think my answer to the question might sound a bit flippant, but my answer to the question is actually it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what the organogram looks like. It doesn't matter what job titles you use, what department titles you use, and it doesn't actually matter how the different roles and responsibilities are split across the different departments. I don't think it matters. I think we should be entirely agnostic about that. I think we should think about who we need to speak to. I think it is really helpful to think about this ladder of value, to get from data, statistics, information, intelligence, insight, get to the top of that ladder. And it's about having the right conversations. And so I don't think the answer is within structures and job titles. I think the answer is within an organizational culture, an organizational mindset, and the ability to bring together the hard data and the softer issues, the warm data, and to bring that together in a meaningful way. And then just giving those conversations the time and the space and the support to get to that higher level of value. So I think it's a great question, and it's kind of the question we always land on, isn't it? What's
Yeah.
the structure?
Where
What's the
should they sit?
answer? I
Yeah.
don't think the answer is in structures. I think the answer is in how we work and how we engage with our colleagues across the university.
For what it's worth, I spent a long time, grieving the loss of those people that I felt I lost from my department to go to the planning function. But sometimes when I see insight professionals sitting inside an external relations directorate, I see some of their reports, and Andy, they're a thing of beauty, uh, but almost a bit over enthusiastic. There's so much in there. There can be reams and reams of insight and intelligence and thoughts and forecasting. And then, of course, let's say if it's for a proposed course launch, they give that over to academic colleagues, and it's going to end up in a drawer. Whereas I think sometimes it's about detaching yourself a little bit, isn't it, from what you're doing, and just making sure what are the 6 key pieces of data that they need.
I think there's a lot in that, and maybe one area we haven't really touched on is that thing of then how you actually communicate
Yes.
what this intelligence is telling us, and what
Mm.
this insight is telling us. And I think one of the things, and I'll talk in terms of stereotypes, and I will apologise in advance for doing that. But there's something about your stereotypical data person as being perhaps a bit geeky, a bit introvert, and kind of not being a great communicator. It's quite a different skill set to be able to tell a story, to create a narrative, and it is so important that once we've done the stuff with data and the interpretation and got to the inside, we then need to take it out and tell a story, because people don't remember numbers.
No.
You don't have the capacity to retain a lot of numbers in your head, but you can always remember a story. And if you're a student of English literature, the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which is a story about telling stories, and the Ancient Mariner bit, which is the bit in the middle, that's the story. But within, it's then wrapped around the old man who tells the story of the Ancient Mariner and the effect that has on the wedding guests that he tells it to. And there is something so powerful about a well-crafted narrative. So you can do all the data crunching you want, you can do all the analysis and insight and all the stuff you want. You then have to turn it into a story, because senior leaders in institutions have a lot going on. They have a lot they have to cope with in their heads, and for God's sake, don't bombard them with numbers. They want a story. All right, it's story time. You have to go into your senior leadership team saying, I'm not going to give you numbers, I'm not going to give you all the statistics, you don't want that. I'm going to tell you a story. Are you sitting comfortably? Then we shall begin. That's where you need to get to.
Oh, and this is why it's a match made in heaven, because if you do have perhaps the data people who are super intelligent, know all of the data back to front, get with a marketer who can tell that compelling story. I just wonder if institutions know what power they actually have if they just talk together.
Yeah.
I think now is the time then to invite some questions. So if you're thinking of a question that you'd like to ask, please pop it in the Q&A or the chat. And while you're thinking of those questions, I'm just going to share with you the title of our next webinar. And there's a QR code there for you to book your place, the conversion conundrum. When we get to September, it will really be time to start thinking about how you convert those early applicants into firm choices. But how do you do that? What techniques can you use to become the first choice? So many institutions talk to me about, why are we always the natural insurance choice? Well, we might have some answers for you, and we might be able to give you some techniques. So I'm going to take you through the 7 pitfalls that we see institutions fall into a lot of times during the conversion conversion period. So please do sign up for that one. So, Amy, welcome. Do we have any questions for Andy or myself?
We do. We have a question for you, a question for Andy, and a question for both of you. So
Okay.
I'll take them in the order they came through. So Penny, you mentioned a couple of times about six sort of killer stats. Could you elaborate a bit on what those might be, or what sorts of things people should look for?
Oh, yeah. So obviously you need to know where your applications are and your conversion rate and how that compares to your competitor set. You need to know exactly who your competitor set is. So often we like to have this inspirational list in our head, but we've got to get real and know who we're actually competing with. We've got to know what our market share is, and importantly, what we need to do to shift the dial on that market share. And some of the stats, which I'm not going to give you because you have to book our session on marketing planning. But yeah, even just those 4 or 5 pieces of data there, if you know those elements for all of your subject areas, you've got your growth strategy right there.
Okay, question for both of you then. Do you have any particular advice for the processes or approach to insights for successful program development?
Andy?
So I'll start. I mean, I guess in many ways it's understanding where the market currently is, and then it's actually a lot about that projecting the future piece. So in terms of, yes, understanding where the market is, it's bringing together the data about who's currently operating in that subject area. So that's your sort of HESA stats, that's your UCAS stats. There's the policy, the trend analysis. There's probably, I mean, there's potentially something about regional analysis in that as well, and kind of reading the runes a little bit. We had this morning the meeting of the Metro mayors with the new Prime Minister, and a sort of reset of that relationship, and a sense that maybe they will become more significant players in this space. So the regionalisation is one to think. With questions like this, I think I'm always nervous about offering a sort of cookie cutter approach, because actually it's largely about getting whatever intelligence and information you can, and thinking about what is important to you in this market area, in this part, in this segment. So yeah, it's about pulling as much of that together. But for something looking into the future, it really majors on the softer stuff, because the data is all historic. Some of the data is very old. We can get some trend stuff, but actually I would always towards the much softer stuff.
I think for me, if you've heard me speak before, you'll almost expect me to say this, but before you think about new course launches, always remember what you've already got. I often think we're standing on this treasure chest looking for some gems elsewhere, and sometimes we have to just do that thorough analysis as to what we've already got and where those pockets of potential growth are if we made some changes to what we're doing already. Because the opportunity cost of a launch and taking our eye off the ball could be hugely damaging. So yeah, I have to mention that.
Two very similar questions have come in about using AI. So how important is using AI to gather insight going to into the future? And sort of complementary question, how is it going to change how data and marketing teams work? So any thoughts on AI in the future?
I'll go first if I can. I must admit to being a fairly extreme skeptic at the moment about AI. There is, as you might have noticed, an awful lot of hype around AI. We had the Tony Blair Institute this morning doing this whole piece about AI is the future. And we keep hearing this thing, AI is the future. But I think there is that we're still kind of scrabbling around for the use cases that make sense. I think there's still an awful lot of the world hasn't really worked out what the killer app or the killer use case is with AI. All AI is at really this sort of, if we're talking large language models, they are systems that string together words, but they are completely devoid of any understanding of what those words mean. And I think that's the big weakness with AI. There was a paper published, a research paper published a few weeks ago that declared, and I'll apologise for language, but AI is bullshit. And they set out a really proper academic definition of the term bullshit, and they then went through how large language models work and why they actually meet that definition of bullshit so well. And it comes down to fundamentally something that it's all about patterns and strings of letters and words, but it is completely devoid of any understanding of what they mean. And I think until we've crossed that bridge, I remain quite skeptical about whether AI is going to do much.
What he said.
A few more questions to come in. I'll try and get through all of them if we've got time. So going back to the conversation about storytelling, and we've got a question here. Sometimes storytelling perhaps not a strong point of people who are working on the numbers. So how do you encourage a numbers person to work with a marketeer rather than just submit a report with loads of numbers in it?
I think there's probably a sense, and again, this will play to the strengths of people who work in marketing. You have to convince them of why just giving people endless tables of numbers isn't actually going to engage with human beings. And so there's almost a sense in which you have to sell the profession of marketing, or the profession of being able to create a narrative. And I think that yeah, you kind of have to sell that. You could take a more Darwinian approach and just let them do that, and they will fail. And then maybe if they fail enough times, they will learn from that. But you know, I think it is interesting because there was so much hype around data and AI and technology and all of that stuff. But actually, to drive change, you have to remember you're in the people business, because that's what changes. It takes interaction with people to drive change. And so yeah, I mean, do engage with your data colleagues. Obviously, do engage with your, because they're wonderful people, and they have lots of knowledge and insight and intelligence, but they have to understand that you have to be able to tell a story, and that it's about these skills coming together. I think get them all onto a webinar like this one, and we will explain it to them.
Yeah, how mean are you? Let them fail. I have to think, Andy, we need to run a workshop together on this, don't we? But actually, a lot of our workshops, you know, when we talk to academic colleagues on how to deliver a great open day pitch, the basic tenet of that workshop is how to tell a great story. And when I think about all of the hits, the wins I've had in my career, it's because I've been able to persuade people, not, you know, a bit of a scattering of data in there, but ultimately by telling a story that kind of captured their attention. Any last few, Amy?
Yeah, there's questions come in from an academic who, unfortunately, their course has been suspended due to low student numbers. Do you have any advice for marketing strategies that they could use as an academic, or what help or information they could seek from their own institution?
Shall I take that, or do you want to take it?
Yeah, no, you go ahead, Penny.
So there might be two reasons why you have low student numbers. The first one might be that simply the market has gone away for it. And although this is a hard thing to hear, sometimes if the market isn't there, it's going to be really difficult to revive the course, no matter how many wow factors you have. But I think the first thing you do need to find out is there still a market? Because there may well still be a growth market for your subject area, but at the moment you're not claiming enough of that pie. You're just not claiming that market share. In which case, I'd say it would be an area for attention, but I think accepting that things probably need to change in how you present that course to the outside world. Any further questions?
The last one, we sort of touched on this sort of side of things, but perhaps if we end on this point again. A question has come in about, we've come a long way since the Cook report, but regulators still assume that consideration of data lies comfortably all in one place. which this person says is rarely the case. So how do we encourage more cross-team discussion of data and insights? For example, planning, quality teams, perhaps SU as well. They've reflected that we seem to pull out all the stops for boards of governors, but rarely for ourselves in terms of this kind of collaboration.
Yeah, if I'll jump in there. So I in my experience, talking about that ladder, that model, information, intelligence, insight, framing it in that way, and how actually the work becomes softer and more collaborative the higher up the ladder we climb. I have found that to be a very powerful way of getting colleagues to engage in discussions around data and actually wanting to drive more value from the data. And it is so telling because people, as Penny did at the start of this, we use these words, we want insight. And so pounce on that. You know, to get to insight, you have to get beyond the data stuff and start getting into the softer stuff, the warm data, whatever you want to call it. And I have found that to be quite a powerful way of opening this conversation and saying the data is only one part of the journey. So yeah, I would recommend that.
I think that's a really nice place for us to close this discussion. Andy, thank you so much. I've learned a lot in the last half an hour. I'm going to be very careful about the use of the word data and insight and statistics. And I really hope that this foresight is going to be coming in the future because it's what we desperately need. So thank you so much, Andy. For those of you who've asked questions that haven't been answered, we'll try our best to get back to you. And please do book our future session on the conversion conundrum. Thank you. Thank you, Andy and Amy.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.